So we're moving on then from the Energy Systems White Paper to the economic impact of hydrogen and fuel cells. We have here Karen Turner, who is Director of the Centre for Energy Policy at the University of Strathclyde, and she's been working on this, and we're very much looking forward to what you have to tell us.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, this was another piece of work involving several people. So there was Oluwa Fisayo Alabi, who works with me at the Centre for Energy Policy doing the economic modelling work. We had Martin Smith and John Irvin at St Andrews on the technical applied side, and also Nick Hughes and Paul Dodds from UCL, who worked in the skills and training chapter. Okay, so we're here today because hydrogen and fuel cell technology can potentially play a number of roles in decarbonising the UK's energy systems. Now, some fuel cells only work on hydrogen as a fuel, while others can operate on natural gas and other hydrocarbons, and these might play a useful crossover role during decarbonisation. Now, previous economic work on hydrogen fuel cells has largely focused on bottom-up models, understanding the costs involved in hydrogen and fuel cell technology and estimating the potential carbon savings. Very little work has been carried out looking at what the wider knock-on macroeconomic effects of any switch to hydrogen and fuel cells may actually be. So this paper, sorry, I forgot to go on there. So this paper looks at what kind of macroeconomic impact we might expect to see as a result of a major shift to hydrogen fuel cells transport in the UK. And this is as an example of what might be expected with more general deployment of these technologies. The paper also discusses some of the factors that are likely to lead to UK economic success and makes recommendations relating to these. Now, hydrogen fuel cell technologies are disruptive. Traditionally, the consumer markets for heat, electricity and transport, the three big mass markets, have been quite separate as a result of different fuels being employed in each. And hydrogen disrupts as it can potentially feed into all three of the consumer mass markets. And this raises an extremely interesting economic question because the three traditional energy vectors have quite different prices per kilowatt hours. Now, one thing that we do in the paper is we consider what happens if we have a single energy vector appearing with hydrogen and get to some kind of single kilowatt price per hour. So in terms of current values, thinking around in the paper, we consider how it's helpful to understand how we currently value a kilowatt hour in each of the three big spaces, the heat, electricity and transport. And first, if we assume that the cost of heat and electricity is effectively the cost of gas, then we already understand how we value heat and electricity from our dual fuel bills. Now, transport's a little bit trickier, but in the paper, we reason through going from our litre of petrol to prices per miles and going through to a kilowatt per hour price that gets us to this ratio at the bottom of the 1 to 3.3 to 9.8. And the main point about this is we're currently playing a lot in terms of our fueling our transport by our traditional means. So moving on to the case of hydrogen, what we did was we estimated again in the paper a hydrogen relative value ratio set, and we get to what's shown on the screen, and I won't go through the calculation, but the main thing is you see that the spread of the cost starts to come down, that the transport cost wouldn't be so high relative to heat and electricity. Now, we must be clear that this doesn't say anything at all about what hydrogen might cost. I mean, that's been one of the problems for the modelling. We don't know what the price may be. This is simply about how we might value a kilowatt hour's worth of hydrogen in the three energy market spaces based on our current understanding of how we use these types of energy. Now, caveats, we must be clear that this type of relative value set of the type that I've just presented is really just giving us a rule of thumb, as it were, and they only apply to the average mass market situation. And an important thing is that across the UK, local energy markets can be anything but average. And local circumstances do matter, and the value proposition could be quite different in different areas of the country. Now, just on this slide, we're really listing some of the benefits of fuel cell applications other than transport, and we're well aware of these. But we focused here on transport, and particularly private transportation in the economic modelling in the paper, For one reason, because it offers kind of the lowest hanging fruit in terms of how we could value a kilowatt hour of hydrogen and have uptake in the UK. Also for some modelling issues in terms of what we are able to model, an economy-wide model, private transport was the best option for us to go with here. So for that reason, now I'm just going to tell you a little bit about some of the key results from the economic modelling work, where we're considering how a switch to hydrogen transport might impact the overall UK economy. And as an economist, I'm really emphasising the idea of switch, because it's not all expansion. If we stop using petrol and diesel, there's going to be an economic contraction. So it's really a net effect that we're talking about. So moving on to the modelling we do in the paper, move from this relative value base. As I said, hydrogen transport was chosen as the likeliest highest value and most rapid uptake for HFC technology in the UK. And this is in terms of the value, in terms of the economy-wide impact that you get for every monetary unit, for every pound that you spend on fuelling, so here fuelling cars. And I think economy-wide impact analysis is crucially important in terms of some of the issues that were discussed in the last paper about actually getting policy support on board. When you look at what might happen in the wider economy, this is how policymakers in different areas, from Treasury across the Bays and other areas, may be brought on board in terms of thinking about hydrogen, and also obviously political and possibly public support as well, if we can see that there's areas for an economic expansion. So on this basis, the key questions for the policy audience are obviously, what are the expected or anticipated economy-wide impacts for the use of development in the hydrogen in the UK? And we focus here, as I said, on private transport. But it's also important to consider is how this is impacted when we factor in that hydrogen would be replacing another fuel type that currently has a supply chain and people employed and things like that. And really, policymakers and stakeholders, we need to start developing a clear picture of the potential wider costs and benefits, the type of trade-offs that are involved. And what we do in this paper is a very simple first step using a method that's called input-output multiplier analysis. And it's not the most sophisticated kind of modelling, but when we talk about multipliers, people across government do tend to understand the type of metrics that you're working with, so they can be a very strong communication tool. Right, the headline message of the input-output modelling is that a significant move away from the current UK use of petrol and diesel and refined and private transport towards hydrogen can be expected to yield a valuable increase in GDP and employment. Now, I'll come on to give you a little bit of the detail on that, but an important thing to note when you look at some of the results that I've got is that the likely gains are not only going to come from the production and distribution of hydrogen and the manufacture of fuel cells and vehicles, but also from a wide range of service sector activities, including finance and others, that are involved in a potentially a strong domestic supply chain. So you really are talking hydrogen economy, multiple sectors would be involved. So the key driver of our findings is that when we look at the supply chain for petrol and diesel, it's currently highly import intensive. And what that means in multiplier terms is it just doesn't have strong backward linkages in the UK economy when compared to things like gas and electricity. And this comes through in Bays' green paper that was published in January. One thing they talk about in terms of energy supply, and they give the example of Hinkley Point, is if energy supply options can develop strong supply chains within the UK economy, there are real potential for there's real potential for economic development. And I think that's the important thing to think about hydrogen relative to petrol and diesel. There's much more opportunity in that respect. So the key questions and issues arising. First of all, obviously, we've chosen electricity and gas supply as proxies in our modelling because hydrogen is just not there enough to come out in the kind of national accounting data that we use. And we chose electricity, obviously, because it's a secondary energy carrier, and gas because of the networks and storage facilities. So the question is, can we expect that hydrogen supply will share the same type of strong domestic supply chain properties of these types of proxy sectors? Second, what are the substitution possibilities between petrol and diesel and hydrogen, and how long is it actually going to take to happen? And then thirdly, and this is quite important when we think about decarbonisation, what are the implications of retaining a fossil fuel base in the hydrogen fuel supply chain if that was the way that we wanted to go, and bearing in mind when we look at things like gas and electricity, a big part of their multiplier is in the offshore oil and gas extraction sector and the support sectors. So our approach, input-output modelling, I'm not going to take you through a lot of detail, but to perhaps give you a picture in your mind, input-output multiplier analysis is a simple starting point for economy-wide analysis. It uses the input-output tables that ONS produce to explain the composition of GDP in any given year, will output GDP, employment and things like that. It works with this type of matrix. Basically what this tells us is along the rows where all the industries sell their outputs in terms of other industries in the UK economy and final consumers, and reading down the columns it tells us where industries get their inputs from. And it's through mathematical manipulation of this information, focusing on the blue part, which is all about industries in the UK selling to each other, and also labour inputs, because people earn money and they go out and spend it in the economy. This is what gives us our multiplier values. The problem is, in this national accounting framework, hydrogen is just not big enough to be represented yet. So that's why we've worked with the proxies. So when we talk about a multiplier, what are we talking about? Well, basically, from working with the input-output data and just some simple mathematical manipulation, and as I said, it's not a sophisticated model, but it gives information that people readily understand. You're talking about if households, if final consumers spend £1 in a sector, in order to meet that demand in the pink box, or the salmon box, industries go and buy things from each other, and in turn the industries that buy from each other buy from other industries, and you get this supply chain going. And then finally, in the purple, what we call induced effects, this is where all the people involved in the supply chain earn money and they go out and spend it in the economy, and all these effects combine to give us the total benefit that we get for £1 being spent. So the headline multipliers that we look at in the paper, the important one to look at the top row here. This is the sector that produces, refines and distributes petrol and diesel. So for every pound we spend, there's £1.47 full spread throughout the economy. There's 2.93 full-time equivalent jobs and 33 pence in GDP. These are the lowest multipliers for the whole of the UK economy. In input-output terms, the UK is divided into 123 industries, and this sector has the lowest ones. So a basic thing we know is if you take £1 of household spending and spend it anywhere else in the economy, you're going to get a bit of a boost. What we've identified here is for electricity and gas, our two proxies, look at how much higher they perform in output. On jobs, you're more than 3 times as many jobs per pound that's spent, and on GDP, and I should emphasise that quite a bit of the GDP component, particularly in terms of gas, is in the offshore industry. So again, we need to think about that. But even if you strip in the paper, we strip out the offshore part of oil and gas extraction, the multipliers are still considerably bigger. But it is important to note that that's in there. So basically, you've got, if people take £1 away from petrol and diesel, spend it on hydrogen, if hydrogen could look like anything like these sectors, you're getting a net boost to the economy. And that's the simple message around what we've done. So what you've got here is it's really all about import intensity, because any time you import, your multiplier leaks, so to speak. So really, could hydrogen replicate the type of properties that we've got for gas and electricity here? Now, the next diagrams I'm going to show you, don't get shocked by them. There's a lot of labels, but the point is there is a lot of labels. What we did here was we took the indirect and the induced parts of these multipliers, and we looked at where in the economy, first of all, the GDP effects lay, and then the employment effects lay. And we took the electricity case, because electricity's got the weaker, so it's the conservative estimates. And what I want you to note here is if you look at all the sectors where GDP arises and where employment arises, you're talking about a full range of sectors around the UK economy. So it really is potentially a hydrogen economy where the spread of benefit would be very wide. So that's the main thing that I want you to take out of that picture for now. Now, one thing is, that's the headline kind of message. It's quite difficult to do scenario analysis for the economy going forward that people are going to believe. It's different to, I guess, technical scenarios. What's going to happen to the economy is different. We need to know about the rate of uptake. We need to know about the price that people would pay per unit. What we did instead was we worked with information from the previous white paper to give us a projections for what the split between hydrogen and petrol and diesel would be. So hydrogen is the green part on the side. And Martin and Oliver Fasayo did some work with kind of potential prices to try and get an idea of the expenditure. But then we just used this as a sense check. What we focused on in our scenarios is knowing that something not so good happens. If people stop buying petrol and diesel, that's money being taken out of the economy. So what we did in the scenario was we said, how much, for the projections from the previous white paper over different time periods, when the spend in petrol diesel is removed, how much spending needs to go into hydrogen to give us a zero net impact in GDP, and then we can see how much spending's left to be spent on other things, and we know that'll be all boost. And we use this as a sense check to check that hydrogen spend would actually, in fact, be there. So what we get in this table, if you look at the row of zeros, we were working to how can we get a zero GDP impact. Along the top, we took information from the previous white paper on the decrease in spend on petrol and diesel in 3 discrete time periods here. We looked at how this translates to spending in refined fuel for the input-output. We used the multiplier to look at the contraction in GDP. This is in pounds million, so it's quite a bit of GDP that's been lost. The losses in full-time jobs over the different time periods. Then what we looked at is using the backing out from the multipliers, we looked at how much would have to be spent on hydrogen. We checked in the last diagram that that spend could potentially be there so that we netted out at zero GDP impact. But even with that, we found that there was a positive impact on employment, and the gross impact is the total jobs that would be associated with the hydrogen. And the second last row shows that you would be, to get the zero GDP impact, you would be getting over 3,000 jobs in the UK economy. But the crucial thing is, that bottom row, there's money left there. Now, we could have done projections. Some of it might be spent on hydrogen, some of it might be spent on other things, but the main thing is it's all there to be spent on UK goods and services that have multiplier effects. The only problem is if we spent it on imported goods. So I think a key thing here is that if the resource used to produce hydrogen is not one that's extracted from the offshore industry, then the employment and value-added components here would be somewhat different, and it might be harder to get the zero net GDP, but it's still the same message that you'd be likely to get positive. So the conclusions from the input-output modelling, first of all, the importance of domestic UK supply chain linkages in delivering economic expansion through these multiplied effects. And this issue is highlighted in the Green Paper and Industrial Strategy in January. What can new energy supply options do in terms of UK supply chains? So that's really important for hydrogen to deliver on. If hydrogen could replicate the type of strong upstream supply linkages that we see with things like gas and electricity, there are opportunities for expansion and through transition to a hydrogen transport economy. Of course, heat and electricity are more difficult because you're replacing something with strong linkages with something else with equal rather than stronger linkages. However, again, we must note that a lot in terms of economic impact terms and jobs throughout the economies does depend on what's the role of continued fossil fuel extraction. And crucially, if we stop extracting it from our own economy and we're importing it, that's going to have leakage effects on these multipliers. And I would say, remember the spread of sectors that were involved in delivering this multiplier. We really need to pay attention to development of the skills base and UK service industries that would allow support of a hydrogen economy. In the paper, we also did give some attention to potential additional multiplier impacts from private and public investment targeted at R&D, construction and things like this. But the important point there is impacts might be time limited. It's only while that step-up activity is taking place. Here we're talking about ongoing operational effects. So, in the final few slides, that's the modelling work we're focused on there. In the final few slides, we're gathering together some of the wider conclusions and recommendations of the paper. Now, at the start here, the first bullet point, this strongly echoes what was said about the UK not being homogenous in terms of energy. While natural gas is the most obvious traditional source of hydrogen for the UK's most heavily populated parts, it makes little sense in the more remote and invariably renewables-rich areas. So good policy needs to recognise regional differences, and it needs to be wisely nuanced. Local and devolved governments are probably best placed to partner with the UK government in ensuring that local support policy is appropriate for local circumstances. Now, we've found that the UK is a good place to expect economic benefit in the hydrogen fuel cell supply generally, and that's echoed in the modelling work that I've just presented. In terms of intellectual property retention, this is probably more about people in that, yeah, well, the skills base is about people, but in terms of intellectual property retention, this is also about being able to retain highly skilled and mobile innovators and employees. It's probably more about that than it is about legally protectable intellectual property. And people in this kind of field are going to continue, they are now and they're going to continue to be highly mobile and in demand. So retaining people is all about the business and social environment that's offered in the UK economy to keep people around and involved. In terms of, sorry, just go back. In terms of finance is another issue here. In order to enable SMEs to grow and become bigger firms, the UK government really has to have a hydrogen fuel cell policy and a clear attitude towards HFC becoming successful and in for the UK economy. And I think an important issue here is clusters in places like Cambridge, IT and biotech clusters have proven extremely effective in attracting the right kind of finance and also the right type of people. And such a clustering model could be followed for HFC technologies, and the paper discusses more than one of these. In terms of export potential, well, some major UK-based HFC supply chain players have been exporting for quite some time, and some core companies already have their technology in Europe and the Far East, mainly South Korea. And generally, there are good prospects for UK export earnings. Now, in terms of support, something that was mentioned by the previous white paper, UK academic, public and third sectors as early HFC adopters have been very successful in applying for and obtaining support from EU programmes, and some have been very reliant on this source of funding support. So obviously, as has been said, Brexit is an important issue. So this is one area where we would recommend that the UK government should give serious consideration to buying into the UK's continued participation in these programmes, potentially, possibly after the Swiss or the Norwegian models, where the UK provides funding for successful UK applicants and participants only. Now, finally, as I've said, hydrogen and fuel cells are disruptive, and they can be a bit confusing for governments devising support policies because they cut across so many traditional sectoral boundaries. And I think it's important here to consider what lessons can be learned, for example, from the case of Germany, where Angela Merkel kind of threw her hands up when everybody was arguing to and fro, but came out with a solution where there was ring-fenced funding for HFC. So I'm going to leave it there and invite you, of course, please to read the paper and the summary if you can't cope with the whole thing. But if you have any questions, we can take them now.
Thank you very much, Karen, and a very impressive piece of work, if I may say so, on something that's extremely difficult to estimate economic impact going forward, decades perhaps, from a nascent industry where innovation and disruption are likely to be order of the day, and therefore projecting that kind of thing to the future, very difficult indeed. So, lots of fascinating things. We've got a question there, we've got a question coming down the front here. Please introduce yourself. There's a mic on its way. Thanks.
Hello, Jo Howes from E4Tech. I've got two quick questions. One is whether the hydrogen production that you considered involved CCS, because I imagine that might change the results quite a lot one way or the other. And the second one was whether the costs of hydrogen production and use that you used matched up with those from the other project that we saw, where the Times modelling showed hydrogen and fuel cells being part of a least cost solution. The reason I ask is because when we've done analysis similar to this before, people sometimes put high costs into the economic value assumption and therefore end up with a lot of economic value and jobs, but they're higher than the cost reduction that you would be needed to actually get that technology deployed within an energy systems model. So you have a kind of tension between policymakers looking for an opportunity for a big economic value, but if that economic value actually was there, then those technologies wouldn't have been deployed in the first place.
Okay, well, I'll answer your second question first quickly, because that's the one that I'm more likely to forget. I mean, the key thing here is what we're doing with this kind of economy-wide analysis. You're not building up from the bottom-up cost, because there's just not enough information there. You know, we need to, for this type of analysis, you need to know what is being bought in terms of the supply, and then what those... when you're buying from one industry, what are they buying from another? And that's why we went with the proxies of electricity and gas. We're really looking at the supply chain linkages rather than the bottom-up costs. But if we wanted to be able to do this without proxies, we would be starting at that point, because what you would be doing is you would be trying to build up a kind of what-if input-output sector where you would build up in orders of scale. You know, you would say for £1 million of output, where are you buying things from? So that's kind of, I think that's the next stage of the analysis, is to try and build that up and represent a sector. And the reason I took that before the CCS question is that we don't have CCS in here because what we've had to do is stick with what's in the national accounts at the moment. But I previously did some work thinking about the potential carbon capture and storage multiplying effects. And there what we had to do was focus on, we didn't have information on the supply chain for CCS. So what we did was we focused on the sectors such as thermal power generation that might survive longer if CCS were there, and we took the multiplier from that. So we did a similar first step as to what we did here. But again, with CCS, what you would be doing is saying, right, and I think it has to be broken out into the capture part, and it has to be broken out into transport and storage. You know, we've got in input-output terms, you have a waste disposal sector. People capture their waste and put it out, and then there's an industry comes and takes it away. And we really need to understand for hydrogen and for CCS how these different, I think we need to think of them as economic service activities so that they get into this type of framework that national policymakers and finance ministries actually listen to.
Thank you. Yes, the front here.
Thanks, Em. Karen.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yes.
Those who may not know you, Nigel. I know you're pretty ubiquitous.
So, Nigel Holmes, I represent the Scottish Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association. So, there's a lot of very good work in these white papers, and they could have a really important part in working with policy teams. But the information in them needs to be actually very robust, and that's been part of my sort of dialogue with the teams about this. In this particular paper, I'm afraid I didn't get the chance to comment properly, but if you go back to the graph that you put up with the uptake of hydrogen transport in the UK. That one, yeah. The images are actually very important in communicating key messages.
Right.
And this one is actually probably far too ambitious. Now, I all the time I'm saying, let's be ambitious, let's push the envelope as far as we can. But we also need to be very realistic.
Yeah.
And this one in particular implies that by 2025, half of the vehicle miles in the UK are using hydrogen.
Yeah.
That is not going to happen.
Yeah.
We'll be lucky if we get there in 2040.
Yeah.
So all I would say is that in communicating messages, and I understand that if you've based it on the McKinsey report, which is 2010, that was probably ambitious at the time.
Yeah.
A lot has changed.
Yeah.
There are supply chain, there's infrastructure, there's all sorts of things that are happening. But to get the message across to policy teams, you do need to be very clear about what we're talking about.
Well, I want to hand over to John in just a second, but I mean, our main thing here was, Nigel, is that we wanted to sense check this. I was very, very wary about taking figures on what the uptake would be. So, you know, we focused on the fact of compensating for losing spending on petrol and diesel. But, I was very wary of working with these timelines because I wasn't convinced, but, we were taking figures from the projection that you're going to get such a drop in petrol and diesel expenditure. I was taking it from the other side. But, no, I see absolutely what you mean. That's why I think that the most useful thing that we've got here is what we've got in the slides here and on here, because we're talking about the strength of the supply chains. I'm very, very wary about doing the scenario analysis that that we've had in both the white papers so far. But I'm going to hand over because there is the technical side of the work as well. I was the economist. Yeah.
You can probably hear me anyway. Nigel's comment is related to what people predict the technology is going to drive, and this report is potential of replacement. I would say that Karen can probably comment on this, but electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles are pretty much on a par in this.
Yeah.
So you will, is that right? Yeah. You'll get similar benefits from electric. So if you put electric and fuel cell together, then that model it looks fine. And from a technology side, there are a lot of things that electric vehicles can't do. And you're not going to have a commuter car that's probably a hydrogen vehicle if you can get a cheap electric vehicle. And so fuel cells are electric vehicles. So I would put the two together and say that's where that's coming. So but this is very much based on the value of transport and
Yeah.
you know, and
Yeah.
There'll be some things that people pick up.
Yeah.
They will base them back on their personal view of the world.
Yeah.
You know, they'll use their personal view of what
Yeah.
changes and how things happen in the real world. And if we're not careful, that view may not agree with what they see in the report, and that may undermine some of the other
Yeah.
key messages
Yeah.
that the report rightly has. You know, so
Yeah.
it's just a word of caution.
Oh no, I think absolutely, and as I say, Nigel, I was very, very wary about doing any, because I'm an economist, so I'm always very, very wary about projecting forward, and so that was, and we tried to temper it by saying compensating for losses rather than doing the but I absolutely take your point. I mean, I think in the work going forward, we have to try and make this more robust in terms of saying, could you get this kind of strength going forward? Because if you could get that kind of, it's kind of like the chicken and the egg, isn't it? In terms of influencing uptake, if people, if policymakers and politicians knew you could potentially get these kind of benefits, that might drive the uptake forward. So it's which one first?
I mean, perhaps I could just comment. I wasn't involved in the particular modelling and stuff, but UCL does quite a lot of these scenario exercises. These scenarios are not predictions. They derive from input assumptions about the way in which energy systems might develop. So no one should be looking at that graph and saying, good heavens, these guys think that in 2025 there will be. What they ought to be saying is, well, that obviously is a very fast deployment of HFCs. That may or may not happen. Perhaps it's too fast. But if it were to happen, what might the economic implications be? And that I think it's very important to interpret scenarios in that kind of way. But thank you for that. We are now more or less on time, but we're going to have just a 5-minute stretch break. The toilets are very close if you need those. We'll be back here in 5 minutes to take the last white paper, and then obviously grab some coffee if it's still there at the back, some drinks, and be back in 5 minutes, please.